the fall of 2024, a young man in his mid-20s placed a trail camera on a white oak about 300 yards above a cattle farm in Highland County, Virginia. The camera was aimed at a flat rock at the base of a sandstone outcrop on the lower slope of Jack Mountain, a ridge that climbs to just over 4,000 feet in the Allegheny Highlands. The rock was not special, but every week, for as long as the young man could remember, someone in his family had carried a bucket of deer scraps or cattle offal up the slope and dumped it on that rock. His grandfather did it. His grandfather's neighbor did it. Another family on the far side of the hollow did it. 3 families on one mountain, leaving food at designated spots in the timber, and they had been doing it for over 40 years. The trail camera was the first time anyone had tried to document what came to collect. What the camera recorded on its 3rd night confirmed what 3 generations of families on Jack Mountain already knew and had never told anyone outside their hollow. A dogman had been living on that mountain for at least 4 decades. It had been fed by the families whose homesteads sit along the gravel road that climbs the Bullpasture River Valley toward McDowell, and the families had kept silent about it for the simple reason that silence was the only arrangement that worked. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. The young man who placed that camera contacted us through the channel in the spring of 2025. We are going to call him Amos. That is not his real name. He asked us to change it, and when you understand how small Highland County is, you will understand why. The entire county has a population of around 2,200 people. The area around McDowell and Doe Hill has maybe 200. Everybody knows everybody. In a community that small, a family reputation is the only currency that matters, and Amos understood that what he was about to share could destroy the reputation his family had built over 3 generations on that mountain. Through Amos, we eventually spoke with his grandfather. We will call him Clyde, early 70s, cattle farmer, born on the property where he still lives, on the lower eastern slope of Jack Mountain where the hardwoods thin out and the pasture opens up to a view of the Bullpasture River Valley that would stop your heart on a clear morning. Clyde's father built the house in the late 1940s after coming home from the war. His grandfather had run cattle on the same ground before that, living in a cabin that burned in 1941 and was never rebuilt. The family has been on Jack Mountain for the better part of a century, and Clyde has spent every day of his life within sight of those ridgelines. Through Clyde, and with considerable reluctance, we were put in contact with a man from the neighboring property. We will call him Merle. Similar age, similar background, similar silence. Merle and Clyde grew up a quarter-mile apart on the same mountain. They went to the same one-room school in Doe Hill. They hunted the same timber. Their fathers helped each other during calving season and shared equipment during hay cutting. And for the better part of 40 years, both families had been feeding the same creature without ever once discussing it directly with each other, until Amos forced the conversation by putting a camera in the woods. Highland County, Virginia is a place that most Americans have never heard of. It sits in the western part of the state, hard against the West Virginia border, in the Allegheny Highlands where the Appalachian ridges run northeast to southwest in long parallel waves of forested limestone and sandstone. The county seat is Monterey, a town of fewer than 200 people. Route 250, the main east-west road, follows the old Staunton-Parkersburg Turnpike. The Battle of McDowell was fought along this road in 1862. The mountains are steep. The valleys are narrow. The forest is dense, mixed hardwood, broken by small farms that cling to the bottomlands along the rivers. The county has one of the highest mean elevations of any county east of the Mississippi. Jack Mountain, where the families in this story live, reaches its highest point at Sounding Knob, just over 4,300 feet. The Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources manages over 14,000 acres of public land on 3 separate tracts as part of the Highland Wildlife Management Area, all of it steep and wild. Below the WMA boundary, the mountain drops into the private land where Clyde and Merle and their neighbors run cattle on pastures carved out of the forest by their grandfathers. There is one other fact about Highland County that matters for this story. The entire county sits within the National Radio Quiet Zone, a 13,000 square mile area of restricted radio frequency emissions centered on the Green Bank Telescope in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. The Quiet Zone limits cellular infrastructure across the region. On Jack Mountain, there is no cell service at all, no towers, no wireless internet. The families communicate by landline or by driving to the valley floor. The isolation means that Jack Mountain in 2025 operates in many ways the same as it did in 1985. The darkness is complete. The silence is real, and the mountain keeps what happens on it to itself. Clyde told us the story in pieces, over 3 phone conversations spread across 2 months. He is not a man who talks easily about this. He spoke slowly, choosing his words, sometimes going silent for 30 seconds before continuing. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He laid out the facts as he understood them, in the order they happened, and let us decide what to make of them. The first encounter happened in the winter of 1983. Clyde was in his early 30s. He had taken over the cattle operation from his father a few years earlier and was running about 40 head of Angus on the pastures below the house. It was a cold January, the kind of cold that the Allegheny Highlands specialize in, where the temperature drops below 0 at night and stays in the single digits during the day, and the wind comes off the ridgeline like a blade. The cattle were in the lower pasture, near the barn, where Clyde could supplement their feed with hay bales and keep the water troughs from freezing. He had been losing calves, 2 in December, 1 in the first week of January. The losses were not catastrophic, but they were unusual. Clyde knew his predators. Coyotes were the main concern for newborn calves, but his Angus cows were protective mothers, and the herd was compact enough that a coyote would have to be desperate or stupid to try for a calf in the middle of 40 adults. Black bears were common on Jack Mountain, but they were denned up by January. The occasional bobcat moved through, but a bobcat taking a calf was rare enough that Clyde had never seen it happen in his lifetime. He suspected a stray dog or possibly a coyote-dog hybrid, which were becoming more common in the region as eastern coyote populations expanded into the Appalachian Highlands. He set up in the barn on a Thursday night with a thermos of coffee and his 30-30 lever action. The barn overlooked the lower pasture from a hayloft door that gave him a clear line of sight across about 200 yards of open ground, with the tree line of the mountain rising beyond the far fence. The moon was nearly full. The snow on the pasture reflected enough light that he could see shapes moving, and the cattle were dark enough against the white ground that he could count them from the loft. He sat there until about 1:30 in the morning, and was starting to consider going back to the house when the cattle moved. They did not spook or stampede. They shifted. The herd compressed, the way cattle do when they sense a predator, tightening into a group with the calves in the center and the adults facing outward. Clyde had seen this behavior with coyotes. The cattle would compress, the coyotes would circle at a distance, and eventually the coyotes would give up and move on because 40 adult Angus presenting a wall of horns and hooves is more fight than any coyote wants. But the cattle did not face outward in all directions the way they do with coyotes, spreading their attention across the full perimeter. They all faced the same direction. Every animal in the herd oriented toward the tree line on the uphill side of the pasture, the side nearest the mountain. Clyde followed their gaze. Something was standing at the fence line. The fence was a 4-strand barbed wire strung between locust posts, standard agricultural fencing, about 4 feet high. Whatever was standing at the fence was visible above the top wire from its midsection up. Clyde could see the upper body and head silhouetted against the snow-covered slope beyond. His first thought was a person, someone from the road, maybe, cutting through his property. Trespassers were not common, but they happened. Hunters who strayed off the WMA land onto private property, or hikers who did not know where the boundaries were. But the proportions were wrong. The silhouette was too wide through the shoulders. The head was too high above the fence line, which meant whatever was standing there was well over 6 feet tall, and the shape of the head was not right. Even in moonlight, even at 200 yards, Clyde could see that the skull was elongated. The top of the head came to points that he initially read as a hat, some kind of winter cap with ear flaps. Then the points moved. They swiveled, independent of the head, the way a dog's ears track sound while the head stays still. He brought the rifle up and looked through the scope. The magnification brought the shape closer but did not resolve it into anything familiar. The body was covered in dark fur or hair. The chest was broad and deep. The arms, and they were arms, hung past the waist, longer than a human's arms would hang on a frame that size. and the head was canine. There was no other word for it. The muzzle projected forward from the skull. The ears stood erect on top. The eyes caught the moonlight and reflected a dull amber glow that Clyde associated with every deer and coyote he had ever spotlighted, the reflective layer behind the retina throwing light back at the source. Clyde sat in that hayloft with his rifle scope pressed to his eye for what he estimated was about 20 seconds. His hands were shaking, and the shaking had nothing to do with the cold. The figure at the fence line stood motionless, looking at the herd. Then it turned its head and looked uphill, toward the dark mass of the mountain above the tree line. It raised one arm. Clyde watched the arm come up and extend to the side in a gesture that he described as a wave, except it was not a wave in the human sense. It was a signal, a directional indication, and from the tree line about 40 yards to the left of where the first figure stood, a second shape emerged. Smaller, lower to the ground, moving on four legs with a fluid, loping gait that covered the distance to the fence in seconds. It reached the first figure and stopped. The two of them stood together at the fence, one upright and one on all fours, looking at the cattle. Then the upright one did something that Clyde has thought about every day for 42 years. It reached down and picked up something from the snow at the base of the fence post. Clyde could not see what it was. A dark mass, roughly the size of a bread loaf. The figure held it in one hand, turned away from the fence, and walked back toward the tree line. The quadruped followed. They disappeared into the timber without making a sound that carried across the pasture to the barn. Clyde sat in the hayloft until dawn. He did not sleep. He did not go out to check the fence line. When the light came up, he walked out to the spot where the figure had been standing. The snow was trampled in an area about 6 feet across. The tracks were large, canine in shape, deeper in the snow than any dog or coyote track Clyde had ever seen. The stride between tracks was enormous, over 4 feet, and at the base of the fence post, in a depression in the snow, was blood. Dark, frozen blood, and scraps of hide and tissue, the remains of a calf. His missing calves had not been killed in the pasture. They had been killed somewhere on the mountain, and the remains had been brought down to the fence line. Clyde went back to the house and sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to construct an explanation that fit inside the world he knew. A bear out of hibernation, standing at a fence. Except bears do not stand with their arms at their sides and signal to a companion, a person in a costume. Except nobody on Jack Mountain had the inclination for that, and the tracks in the snow were not human. A large, feral dog. Except feral dogs do not stand 6.5 feet tall on 2 legs and carry objects in one hand. He did not tell his wife. He did not tell Merle. He did not call the game warden. He went to the farm supply in Monterey that afternoon and bought 100 pounds of meat scraps from the butcher counter, the cheap cuts and offal that the store sold for dog food and bait. He drove home, walked up the slope above his upper pasture to a flat rock at the base of a sandstone ledge about 300 yards into the timber, and dumped the scraps on the rock. Then he went home and waited. The next morning the rock was clean. Every scrap was gone. No tracks in the frozen ground around the rock, which was sheltered enough by the overhang that the soil did not hold impressions. But the meat was gone. He put out more that evening. Gone by morning. He did this for a week. Every offering taken. Every morning the rock was bare. On the 8th night, he lost no calves. He lost no calves the 9th night, or the 10th, or any night for the rest of that winter. The calf losses stopped completely. Clyde did not pretend to understand why. He understood only the correlation. When he put food on the rock, nothing came for his cattle. When the rock was empty, things went missing. The logic was simple enough that it did not require a theory about what was eating the food. It required only consistency. Keep the rock supplied, and the arrangement held. He kept it supplied. Through the rest of that winter, through the spring and summer and fall, through the following winter, he developed a routine. Once a week, usually on a Saturday, he would carry a bucket of scraps up the slope, deer remains during hunting season, when he and half the county were processing venison, cattle offal during calving season, when the afterbirth and occasional stillborn calf provided material that would otherwise be buried or burned, chicken carcasses when his wife processed birds from the laying flock. Whatever organic waste the farm produced that had meat on it went to the rock. The rock was always clean by morning. Clyde did not see the figure at the fence line again for over a year. The feeding arrangement seemed to have drawn a boundary. The Dogman, or whatever it was, stayed above the pastures. It did not approach the barn. It did not come near the house. The cattle settled into their normal patterns. The calving seasons proceeded without unusual losses, and the only evidence that anything abnormal was happening on Jack Mountain was a weekly bucket of scraps disappearing overnight from a flat rock 300 yards into the timber. It was not until the fall of 1984 that Clyde learned he was not the only one. He and Merle were sitting on Merle's porch after a day of working cattle, the kind of afternoon that men in Highland County have been spending together for generations. 2 chairs, 2 beers, a view of the valley, and the comfortable silence of people who have known each other their whole lives. Merle's property adjoined Clyde's on the north side, separated by a fence line that ran up the mountain through the timber. Merle ran a smaller herd, about 25 head, on steeper ground, and his pastures backed up against the WMA boundary where the managed forest began. Clyde does not remember exactly how the conversation started. He thinks Merle said something about the meat scraps, about the bucket. Something offhand, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows about. And Clyde went still, because he had never mentioned the bucket to anyone, and the fact that Merle knew about it meant one of 2 things. Either Merle had been watching him carry scraps into the timber, which was possible but unlikely given the terrain between their properties, or Merle was doing the same thing. Merle was doing the same thing. He had started in the spring of 1984, about 14 months after Clyde's first encounter. Merle's experience was different in the specifics, but identical in the structure. He had been hearing sounds at night, coming from the ridge above his upper pasture. Sounds he could not identify. Deep, low vocalizations that carried through the hollows with a clarity that meant whatever was producing them had significant lung capacity and was not far away. The sounds came in sequences, repeated patterns with variations that reminded Merle of a conversation he could not follow. He described them as halfway between a foghorn and a wolf howl, except wolves had been gone from Virginia for over a century and foghorns do not operate on mountaintops at 2 in the morning. Then he started finding tracks. Large canid prints in the mud along the creek that ran through his property, in soft ground near the spring box where his cattle watered. The tracks were too big for coyote and the wrong shape for bear. Merle was an experienced hunter who had tracked deer and bear on Jack Mountain since he was old enough to carry a rifle. He knew every track the mountain produced. These did not belong. Then his neighbor on the other side, a woman we will call Doris, mentioned to Merle's wife at church that something had been getting into her chicken house. Doris and her husband had a small homestead about a half-mile further up the hollow, closer to the WMA boundary, on ground that was steeper and more timbered than either Clyde's or Merle's places. The chicken house was a solid structure, built from locust posts and hardware cloth with a plywood roof. Whatever got in had peeled the hardware cloth away from the frame along the bottom edge, bending the heavy gauge wire back with enough force to open a gap about 2 feet wide. It took 6 chickens. Doris's husband assumed a bear, though the damage pattern did not look like bear work. Bears typically push through doors or walls. They do not peel wire mesh with the precision of someone using a can opener. Merle walked up to Doris's place and looked at the chicken house. The hardware cloth was peeled back in a way that showed individual grip points where something had grabbed the wire and pulled. The grip points were spaced about 3 inches apart, consistent with a large hand, and the wire was bent at angles that required steady downward force. A bear's paw is wide and blunt. It would crush and flatten rather than grip and peel. What Merle saw at the chicken house looked like the work of something with fingers. He did not say that to Doris. He helped her husband repair the wire and reinforce the frame with additional screws and a heavier grade of mesh. And that night, for the first time, he carried a bucket of meat scraps to a spot on his own property, a flat area at the base of a rock ledge about 200 yards above his upper pasture, and left it there. In the morning, the food was gone. Merle and Clyde sat on that porch in the fall of '84 and, for the first time, compared notes. They spoke carefully, the way men do when they are stepping into territory that might make them look foolish. Neither used the word Dogman because neither had heard the word. Neither had a category for what they were dealing with. They had only the evidence, the tracks, the sounds, the silhouette at the fence line, the chicken house, and that feeding worked. What emerged from that first conversation, and from the conversations that followed over the next several years, was an understanding of the arrangement that both men had arrived at independently, and that Doris and her husband had arrived at as well, though the families would not discuss it openly as a group for another decade. The understanding was simple. Something lived on Jack Mountain that was not in any field guide. It was large, it was intelligent, and it was territorial. It considered the upper slopes of the mountain its domain. When it came down to the farms, it was for food, calves, chickens, whatever was available and vulnerable. But when food was provided voluntarily, left at designated spots in the timber above the pastures, the creature stayed above the line. It did not come for the livestock. It did not approach the houses. It did not threaten anyone. The arrangement was a boundary agreement, enforced by protein. Clyde put it plainly during our second phone call. He said, "We figured out pretty quick that it was easier to feed the thing than to fight it. We were not in a position to fight it anyway. You cannot shoot something you cannot find during the day, and you cannot trap something that is smarter than the trap. So we fed it, and it left us alone. And after a while, it stopped being strange and started being Tuesday. You just took the bucket up the hill the way you took the hay to the barn. It was a chore, part of the operation, a cost of doing business on that mountain." The feeding continued through the 1980s and into the 90s. Clyde maintained his spot on the flat rock below the sandstone ledge. Merle maintained his at the rock shelf above his upper pasture. Doris's family, after the chicken house incident, began leaving food at a stump about 150 yards above their property line. 3 families, 3 feeding sites, all on the same mountain, all serving the same purpose. And all 3 families kept silent, each assuming the others would think they were crazy if they ever brought it up. The silence was practical. These families depended on their reputations for everything from equipment loans to emergency help during calving. A man who feeds a monster on the mountain is not a man whose judgment you trust when he asks to borrow your tractor. Highland County is small enough that one strange story can define a family for generations. What broke the silence within the mountain community, if not beyond it, was a night in November of 1993 when 3 families independently heard the same sound at the same time and could not pretend anymore that each of them was dealing with this alone. It was a Tuesday night, clear sky, low 20s. Clyde was in bed when the sound woke both him and his wife around 2:15 in the morning. A vocalization coming from the mountain above the farms, pitched low enough that the walls of the house did not block it. The sound entered the bedroom as a vibration Clyde felt in his chest before he processed it as something he was hearing with his ears. His wife sat up and asked what that was. Clyde told her it was probably elk. There were no elk in Highland County in '93, but it was the only answer he could give her. The sound continued for about 12 minutes, a series of tonal variations that rose and fell in patterns that repeated with slight modifications, like someone speaking a language with a limited vocabulary. The pitch ranged from a bass register Clyde felt in his sternum to a mid-range tone he could hear through the closed window. The volume was significant. Whatever was producing this was doing it with large lungs and a resonating chamber built for projection. Merle heard it. His wife heard it. Doris and her husband heard it. 3 households on the same mountain, all woken within the same minute. The next morning, Merle drove to Clyde's place. He did not call ahead. He did not make an excuse for the visit. He pulled into the driveway, walked to the porch, and said, "You heard it." Clyde said he had. They stood on the porch and looked at the mountain and did not speak for a while. Then Merle said Doris had called him that morning, which was unusual because Doris did not call people at 7 in the morning. Doris had asked Merle if he heard the sound last night, and Merle had said yes, and Doris had been quiet for a long time, and then she had asked Merle if he was feeding it too. That phone call was the first time any of the families acknowledged to each other that they all knew what was on the mountain and they were all engaged in the same arrangement. From that morning forward, the 3 families operated as a quiet partnership. They coordinated feeding schedules. They shared information about tracks and sounds. They established rules. Do not go above the feeding sites after dark. Do not bring strangers to the upper slopes. Do not leave the dogs outside overnight. And above all, do not point a weapon at it. That last rule came from an incident in the spring of 1989. Clyde had been checking fence on his upper pasture, carrying his 30-30 out of habit, walking the fence line through a stand of mature white oak about 200 yards below his feeding site. The leaves were not fully out. He could see 50 or 60 yards into the timber. He saw it. It was standing between two oak trunks, uphill from him, about 80 yards away, upright, motionless, watching him with an attention that Clyde described as the most focused thing he had ever been subject to in his life. It was like being looked at by something that was reading everything about you at once, he said. Your speed, your direction, what you were carrying, whether you were a problem. Clyde stopped walking. He held the rifle across his body, barrel pointed at the ground, the way you carry a firearm when you are not presenting a threat. He stood still. The creature stood still. They looked at each other for what Clyde estimated was 15 to 20 seconds. Then Clyde shifted the rifle. Not intentionally, not raising it toward the creature. His hand slipped on the sweating stock and the barrel came up about 6 inches, angling toward the trees. A tiny movement. The creature noticed. The body shifted from stillness to tension in a single motion, the shoulders squaring, the head dropping, the legs bending. A posture Clyde recognized from 40 years of working around animals, the posture of something that has just decided whether to fight or run and has not committed to either. The transition was faster than any animal response he had seen. Clyde lowered the rifle barrel back to the ground. Slowly, with care, he held it there. The creature held its posture for another 3 or 4 seconds, watching him. Then it relaxed. The shoulders dropped. The legs straightened. It turned and walked into the timber, moving uphill, not running, not hurrying, just leaving. The message received and the correct response given. Clyde went home and put the rifle in the closet. From that day forward, he never carried a firearm above his upper pasture. He told Merle, and eventually Doris, the same thing. Do not point a weapon at it. It knows what weapons are. It understands the gesture. And if you make that gesture, you are changing the terms of an arrangement that has kept your cattle alive and your family safe for years. The families listened. No one carried a rifle into the upper timber after that. If you have driven Route 250 through Highland County, if you have turned south on State Route 678 toward McDowell and looked up at the ridgelines of Jack Mountain, let us know in the comments. Because the reports we have been pulling together from the Allegheny Highlands over the past several months suggest that stretch of mountains has a pattern of activity that goes back a lot further than 1983. The arrangement held through the 90s and into the 2000s. The families fed the creature. The creature stayed above the feeding line. Calves were born and raised without unusual losses. Chickens stayed in their houses. Dogs barked at the mountain after dark and were brought inside. Life on Jack Mountain continued in its rhythm of seasons and chores and the slow accumulation of years that defines rural existence in the Appalachian Highlands. But the arrangement was not static. Over the decades, the creature's behavior evolved in ways that suggested it was not simply accepting food. It was studying the families the way the families were studying it. Clyde noticed the first signs of this in the mid-90s. His feeding site, the flat rock below the sandstone ledge, had been in the same location for over a decade. Every Saturday he carried the bucket up. Every Sunday morning the rock was clean. The routine was fixed, but in the fall of 1995, Clyde was delayed. A fence repair on the lower property kept him busy all day Saturday, and he did not make it up the hill before dark. He decided to wait until Sunday morning. When he walked up to the rock on Sunday at first light, the rock was not empty. It was marked. 4 parallel scratches in the sandstone, deep enough that they had removed the weathered surface and exposed the lighter rock beneath. The scratches ran vertically, from about 3 feet above the rock surface to just above head height. They were evenly spaced, roughly 3 inches apart, and each one was about a 1/4 inch wide. Clyde recognized the marks. He had seen similar scratches on trees in the timber above the feeding sites, always at heights between 5 and 7 feet, always in groups of 4. Territorial markers, the kind of sign that a large predator leaves to communicate its presence and its claim. But these marks were on the feeding rock, on the surface where Clyde placed the food, and they had appeared the one time in 12 years that the food was not there on schedule. He read the message. The food was late. The marks were a reminder, not a threat. Exactly. More like a landlord leaving a note on the door when the rent check does not arrive on the first of the month. A communication that said, "I noticed, and I expect this to be corrected." Clyde corrected it. He never missed a Saturday again. Merle had a similar experience in 1998. He had been hospitalized for a week with pneumonia, and his wife did not keep the feeding schedule while he was in the hospital. When Merle got home and walked to his feeding site, he found tracks circling the empty spot where the food should have been. The tracks came back 2 more nights. On the 3rd night, something had left a deer carcass on Merle's back porch. The hindquarters and the rib cage, torn apart rather than butchered, deposited on the porch boards sometime between midnight and dawn, centered directly in front of the door. You could not open the door without stepping on them. Merle told us he stood in his kitchen looking at the deer remains through the window for about 10 minutes before he understood what he was looking at. The creature had reversed the arrangement. It had brought food to him. The creature understood the schedule. It noticed when the schedule was broken. It tracked the disruption to its source, and it responded with an action that communicated on multiple levels. "I know you are here. I know the food stopped. Our relationship is mutual." Merle resumed the feeding schedule the day he got out of bed. He has not missed a week since. By the early 2000s, the 3 families had accumulated nearly 20 years of observational data about the creature, though none of them would have used that term. They were not conducting a study. They were managing a relationship. But the aggregate of their observations, shared in quiet conversations on porches and around kitchen tables, assembled a portrait of the Dogman that is unlike anything else in the encounter literature, because it is based not on a single sighting or a brief recording, but on decades of close proximity. The creature was solitary for the first several years. One individual, large, dark-furred, operating above the 3 farms. But by the late 1980s, the families began observing evidence of a second individual, smaller tracks alongside the larger ones, a second silhouette on the ridgeline at dusk, occasionally moving on all 4s when the larger one walked upright. By the mid-90s, there were at least 3. The feeding amounts had to increase. Clyde saved more aggressively from his cattle operation. Merle started buying bulk chicken backs from the poultry processor in Harrisonburg, making the 90-minute round trip once a month. Doris's family supplemented with roadkill deer. 3 families spending time and money to feed a predator they could not identify because the alternative was worse. Clyde addressed the obvious question before we asked it. Why not call someone? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources manages the Highland WMA, 14,000 acres. They employ biologists and game wardens who know the mountain. And the predator classification database those biologists use has categories for black bear, coyote, bobcat, and the occasional dispersing cougar. There is no category for a 7-foot bipedal canine. No form, no field. If Clyde walked into the wildlife office in Verona and described what was living above his pasture, the response would not be an investigation. It would be concern for Clyde, for his mental state. In Highland County, where everybody knows everybody, that concern would follow him for the rest of his life. He said something else that stayed with us. He said the arrangement worked. The creature had never hurt anyone. It had coexisted with 3 families for over 4 decades without violence. Why risk destroying that by bringing in outsiders who would want to study it, trap it, document it? Every one of those actions would disrupt the creature's territory and potentially end the coexistence. Clyde's silence was risk management. The known arrangement was working. The unknown consequences of disclosure were catastrophic. This is where Amos enters the story. He grew up hearing his grandfather's rules about the mountain without understanding why they existed. Do not go above the upper pasture after dark. Do not leave the dogs out. Do not point a weapon at the timber. He was 16 when Clyde sat him down and told him what was on the mountain. Everything. The fence line encounter, the feeding, the vocalizations, the rifle incident. Amos's reaction was what Clyde expected from a teenager who had grown up watching cryptid content on the internet. He wanted to see it. He wanted to get proof. Clyde, shut that down. No cameras. No proof. The arrangement works because we leave it alone. Clyde said the creature had found and destroyed 3 of his own game cameras years earlier. Cameras were not welcome in its territory. Amos respected his grandfather's wishes for about 8 years. In that time, he heard the vocalizations twice, found tracks once along the creek after a heavy rain, canid prints wider and about an inch longer than his size 12 boot, and he saw it once, briefly, on an October evening. Something upright, tall enough that its head and shoulders cleared the brush at the pasture margin, crossing the upper boundary with a ground-covering stride. In the fading light, he could see the pointed ears and the forward projection of the muzzle. The profile was clear, even in failing light. It was the thing his grandfather had described, and it was real, and it was still on the mountain. Amos placed the trail camera in the fall of 2024. He bought a standard infrared unit with a black flash that emitted no visible light when it triggered. He built a housing out of bark and moss to break up the rectangular outline that the creature seemed to recognize. He mounted it inside a hollow in the trunk of a large white oak near Clyde's feeding rock, angling the lens through a natural gap in the bark. He placed it on a Wednesday without telling Clyde or Merle. He knew both men would have told him not to do it. The camera survived 3 nights. On the first night, it captured deer, a doe, and 2 fawns moving through the area around midnight, browsing on the vegetation near the rock, standard forest traffic. On the second night, it captured a raccoon investigating the remnants of the previous Saturday's feeding. Normal. Expected. On the third night, it captured the Dogman. The footage is infrared, recorded sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning. Amos walked me through what the camera recorded, and his description was careful, the kind of careful that comes from having watched something so many times that you have memorized the sequence down to individual frames. The creature enters the frame from the left, moving on 2 legs. The stride is smooth, the kind of locomotion that looks effortless because the body is designed for it. The infrared shows the heat signature clearly. The torso is broad, radiating heat from a body mass that Amos estimated at between 300 and 400 pounds based on the depth of the impressions it left in the soil around the rock. The arms hang long, past the hips, swinging slightly with each step. The head is canine. There is no ambiguity. No angle of light or shadow that might allow another interpretation. The muzzle extends forward. The ears are pointed and erect. The eyes catch the infrared emitter and flare white in the image. It walks to the rock, stops, and looks down at the food Clyde had placed there 2 days earlier. Then it crouches. The motion is fluid, a single transition from upright to a low squat that brings its head level with the rock surface. It reaches for the food with one hand, and the infrared shows the fingers clearly. 5 digits. Long. Articulated. The thumb opposing the palm as the hand closes around a piece of meat. It lifts the meat to its mouth and eats. There is no hurry. No scanning for threats. No wariness. It eats the way you eat at your own kitchen table. When the food is gone, the creature stands. Full height. The infrared does not provide color, but the proportions and the silhouette are clear against the background of the sandstone ledge. 7 feet, give or take. Broad through the chest and shoulders, thick through the legs. A frame built for power and endurance. It stands at the rock for a few seconds, looking into the forest, and then it turns and walks back the way it came, left to right across the frame, into the darkness, gone. The whole sequence, from entry to exit, lasted about 40 seconds. It is the longest continuous trail camera recording of a dogman approaching a known feeding site that we are aware of. And what makes it different from every other trail camera clip in the dogman literature is the behavior. This creature is not passing through. It is not investigating something unfamiliar. It is arriving at a designated location to collect food that it expects to be there, left by humans it has been interacting with for 4 decades. The casualness is what hits you. The complete absence of caution. This is an animal that trusts the arrangement. On the 4th night, the camera was gone. Amos hiked to the oak tree and found the hollow empty. The bark and moss housing was on the ground, pulled apart, the camera body removed and carried away. The SD card, which Amos had backed up to his laptop via a cable connection after each of the first 3 nights, was safely at home. But the camera itself was gone. Not destroyed nearby. Gone. Taken from the site entirely. Amos told Clyde about the camera after the footage was secured. Clyde watched the clip twice. When it was over, he closed the laptop and said, "Now you know." Then he said Amos had gotten lucky. The creature found the camera and took it, which meant it knew the camera was there but had allowed it to operate for 3 nights before removing it. That implied assessment beyond simple object recognition. Clyde had experienced the same thing in the late 80s. His first 2 game cameras were destroyed within 24 hours. The third lasted 5 days. The fourth was gone in 48 hours. After that, he stopped trying. That Amos's camera survived 3 nights suggests either that the creature's vigilance has shifted over 4 decades, or that it chose to be recorded this time. Clyde was not comfortable with either reading. The footage that Amos captured is one piece of a much larger body of evidence that, taken together, represents the most extended documentation of a long-term human-dogman coexistence ever reported. 3 families, 1 mountain, over 40 years. An arrangement built on food and mutual restraint that has survived generational turnover on the human side and apparent population growth on the creature's side without a single incident of violence. What the families learned over those 4 decades fills gaps in the Dogman encounter literature that single sightings can never address. They learned the creature's seasonal patterns. In spring and summer, when deer and turkey populations were at their highest, the creature's activity near the farms decreased. Food sometimes sat for 2 or 3 days before being collected. In fall and winter, the feeding sites were visited nightly. Food left on a Saturday evening was gone by Sunday dawn without exception. Winter was when the arrangement was tested. Clyde described the winter of 1994 as the year it almost failed. The snow was so deep that the wild deer left the mountain entirely. The family's weekly offerings were not enough. For the first time in a decade, something got into Merle's livestock. A yearling heifer was killed in the lower pasture, found with its throat opened and its hindquarters partly consumed. The kill pattern matched what Clyde had seen at the fence line in '83. Merle doubled his feeding immediately. Clyde and Doris did the same. For the rest of that winter, the 3 families were putting out nearly 100 pounds of meat per week. The livestock kills stopped. After that winter, all 3 families increased their baseline feeding and maintained a surplus of frozen meat as a buffer. The historical context for what is happening on Jack Mountain reaches further back than any of the families' experience. The Allegheny Highlands were Shawnee hunting territory for centuries before European settlement. The Shawnee used the forested ridgelines as travel corridors and hunting grounds, their territory extending through what is now West Virginia, Western Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. By the 1750s, most Shawnee communities had moved west across the mountains in response to colonial pressure, but their knowledge of the land did not leave with them. Early European settlers in the Allegheny Highlands left scattered accounts of creatures in the high country that moved on 2 legs and were associated with specific ridgelines. These frontier references from the 1770s and 80s used the vocabulary of their era, calling them devils or beasts or things in the mountains. The accounts are fragmentary, but the geographic patterns match. They cluster along the same Allegheny ridgelines where modern sightings are reported, in the same kind of terrain where something large could maintain territory for generations without regular detection. Linda Godfrey's research documented Dogman encounters across the eastern United States, with significant clusters in the Appalachian Mountains from West Virginia to North Carolina. The behavioral patterns she identified, nocturnal activity, territorial marking, camera awareness, chosen restraint in encounters with humans, are present in the Jack Mountain account. The creature Clyde first saw at the fence line in '83 behaves the same way the creatures at the Umatilla Depot behaved in Oregon, the same way the Pine River creature behaved in Michigan. The geography changes, the terrain changes, the behavior is the same. The Shawnee relationship with the Allegheny Mountains spans thousands of years, and their ecological knowledge of the region was comprehensive enough that if something like the creature on Jack Mountain existed during their presence on this land, they would have known about it. The pattern of quiet acknowledgement followed by boundary setting that we see in other indigenous responses to Dogman inquiries is consistent across the continent. What happened to Carl and Boyd on the Umatilla Depot in Oregon, when Boyd's Cayu's grandmother had a word for the creatures that she would say and then go quiet, matches what Clyde described hearing from an old man in Pendleton County, West Virginia, just across the state line. The old man told Clyde in the early 90s that his own grandfather had fed them too. Used that word. Fed them. Said it was what you did if you wanted to keep your stock alive. You just kept the food coming and they kept their side of the line. He did not use the word dogman. He called them the Ridge Walkers. He said the name went back as far as anyone in his family could remember. Ridge Walkers. The term does not appear in any dogman research we have reviewed. It may be specific to the Allegheny Highlands, a local name for a creature known to people in these mountains for longer than anyone has kept records. The name describes what the creature does. It walks the ridges. It patrols the high ground. It moves along the spine of the mountain the way a fence rider moves along a property line. The most striking aspect of the Jack Mountain coexistence is what it implies about the creature's understanding of reciprocity. A wild predator does not negotiate. A bear returns to a food source until it is exhausted. A wolf pack kills livestock or is scared off. Neither involves an ongoing agreement. What the Jack Mountain families describe is a relationship in which the creature understands the terms of a deal and maintains them across time. Food appears on the rock. Livestock are left alone. If the food stops, the livestock are fair game. If the food resumes, the arrangement restores. The creature remembers the terms. It enforces them, and when the terms are violated, it communicates its displeasure through territorial marks and porch visits rather than through violence. Amos was the one who told us about the most important discovery, and it is the piece of this story that changes the equation entirely. It came not from the trail camera footage, but from a pattern he noticed in his grandfather's cattle records. Clyde has kept meticulous records of his herd for decades. Birth dates, weights, health events, veterinary visits, losses, every calf born and every calf lost, documented in a series of leather-bound ledgers that fill a shelf in his office. Amos had been going through these records as part of learning the operation, and he noticed something in the loss columns that stopped him. Before 1983, the year Clyde started feeding the creature, the herd averaged between 4 and 6 calf losses per year. Some years worse, some better, but consistently in that range. The losses were attributed to the usual causes: coyotes, exposure, stillbirth, occasionally a bear, standard attrition for a cattle operation in the Allegheny Highlands. After 1983, the losses dropped. And they did not just drop by the 2 or 3 calves per year that could be attributed to removing the creature's predation. They dropped to nearly zero. In the 41 years since the feeding began, Clyde's herd has averaged fewer than 1 calf loss per year. Some years, no losses at all. The predation by the creature stopped, which accounted for part of the improvement. But the coyote predation stopped too. The bear predation stopped. The total attrition from all predator causes dropped to a level so far below the regional average that it could not be explained by the removal of one predator from the equation. Amos had a theory. It took him 6 months to gather enough evidence to confirm it, and even then, confirmed might be too strong a word. What he documented was a correlation strong enough that dismissing it required ignoring a data set that spanned 4 decades. The dogman was not just refraining from taking Clyde's cattle, it was preventing other predators from taking them. Amos found the evidence in the timber above the pastures, coyote carcasses, 3 over the course of a year. In the zone between the feeding sites and the upper pasture boundary, the coyotes had been killed by something that was not a trap, not a bullet, and not another coyote. One had a crushed skull, another had a broken spine. Something had killed the coyotes in the buffer zone and left the bodies. The dogman was patrolling the boundary between its territory and the farms, and it was killing predators that entered the buffer zone heading toward the livestock. The feeding arrangement had not just neutralized the dogman as a threat, it had converted it into a guardian. The creature was protecting the food source, not out of affection, out of rational self-interest. The food came from the farms. If coyotes killed calves, the farm suffered, and the food supply was affected. The creature was managing its resource the way any intelligent entity manages a resource it depends on. This reframing turns the entire encounter literature on its head. The Dogman reports that dominate the field, the brief, terrifying sightings, the aggressive encounters, the equipment destruction, may represent not the creature's default behavior but its response to humans who have not established terms. A stranger entering the creature's territory without an arrangement is a trespasser. A family that feeds the creature has a lease. The aggression and the coexistence may be two aspects of the same territorial intelligence, applied differently depending on the relationship. Clyde did not frame it in those terms. Clyde framed it the way a cattle farmer would. He said, "It is like having the biggest, meanest guard dog in the world sitting on your property line. You do not own it. It does not love you, but as long as you feed it, nothing gets past it. And the day you stop feeding it, it remembers that it is not your dog." The human cost of 40 years of secrecy is written in the faces of the people who have carried it. Clyde is a man who has spent his entire adult life maintaining a routine that he can never explain to his veterinarian, his accountant, or his neighbors who are not part of the arrangement. When the vet asks why his calf losses are so far below the county average, Clyde says he is lucky. When neighbors notice the weekly trips into the timber with buckets, he says he is composting. When his wife, who has known the truth since the early 90s, mentions it in conversation, she refers to it as the chore, the same euphemism they all use, stripping the act of its context, so it sounds like nothing more than another item on the endless list of tasks that keeps a mountain farm running. Merle's burden is different. His health has declined in recent years. The pneumonia in '98 was the first in a series of respiratory problems that have made the climb to his feeding site increasingly difficult. His son, who lives in Staunton, does not know about the arrangement. Merle has not told him. Merle's wife handles the feeding when Merle cannot, carrying the bucket up the hill on bad days. But she is in her late 60s herself, and the slope is steep and the footing is treacherous in winter. The arrangement requires physical labor, and the people who maintain it are aging, and the question of who takes over when they cannot do it anymore hangs over the mountain like the weather. Doris has a different problem. Her husband died in 2018. Her children live in other states. She is alone on the most isolated homestead, closest to the WMA boundary. She is in her late 70s with arthritis that makes the slope to her feeding site impossible without help. Merle has been carrying her portion for the past 3 years, adding her site to his own weekly circuit. The arrangement that has protected 3 families for 4 decades is balanced on the shoulders of aging people who will not be there much longer. Amos is the youngest person who knows the truth, and he is 25 years old, and he is not sure he wants to spend the next 40 years of his life carrying a bucket up a mountain every Saturday. Not because he is lazy, because he is not sure the arrangement should continue in secrecy. He is not sure that what his grandfather built is sustainable without more people knowing about it, without some kind of plan for what happens when Clyde and Merle and Doris are gone, and the feeding stops, and the creatures on the mountain revert to the behavior that prompted the arrangement in the first place. That is why Amos contacted us. He does not want publicity. He does not want researchers or cameras or thrill seekers on Jack Mountain. He wants someone outside the hollow to know that this exists. Because if the arrangement fails, if the feeding stops, if the creatures come down from the mountain looking for what they were promised, someone should understand the history. Someone should know that for 4 decades, 3 families managed a coexistence with a predator that wildlife science does not acknowledge, and they did it through intelligence and patience and a willingness to make accommodations that no institution would sanction and no authority would believe. The institutional gap that protects the Jack Mountain secret is the same gap that protects every Dogman location. The Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources has no classification for the creature. The Forest Service has no protocol for an undocumented large bipedal predator. The Highland County Sheriff's Office has no procedure for investigating claims of a dogman guarding cattle. And the local community provides no safe space for disclosure. Nobody designed this silence. It exists because the systems that would process the information were never built to accommodate it, and the people who know the truth have calculated that the cost of speaking exceeds the cost of silence. The trail camera footage that Amos captured sits on a laptop in a house in Highland County, Virginia. 40 seconds of infrared recording showing a dogman feeding at a designated site maintained by a human family for over 4 decades. The footage has not been shared with any agency, any institution, any researcher. It exists as documentation of an arrangement that the world is not ready to process and that the families are not ready to publicize. The creatures are still on Jack Mountain. They are in the timber above the pastures where Clyde's father built a house in the late 1940s, and where 3 families have been running cattle and raising children and carrying buckets up the slope every Saturday for as long as most of them can remember. They are up there in the oak and hickory and beech, moving along the ridge lines in the dark, patrolling the boundary between their territory and the farms, killing the coyotes that come too close to the calves, collecting the food that appears on the rocks with the regularity of a tide, and maintaining an arrangement that both sides understand, even if neither side can explain it in terms the other would recognize. The arrangement is older than Amos. It has survived drought and blizzard, and the death of the men who started it, and the aging of the men who continued it. It is an agreement between species written in meat and silence, and it has lasted longer than most human contracts, because both parties have kept their end. Clyde told us one more thing during our last conversation. He said that last November, on a Saturday evening, he carried the bucket up to the rock the way he has done over 2,000 times. The light was fading. The temperature was dropping. The mountain was going quiet the way mountains do in late fall when the leaves are down and the wind stops and the forest holds its breath between autumn and winter. He dumped the scraps on the rock and turned to walk back down the slope. He heard it behind him, the low vocalization, the one he had been hearing since 1993, the tone that sits below the range of comfortable hearing and vibrates in the bones of the chest. Close, closer than he had ever heard it while standing in the open. He did not turn around. He stood there facing downhill, looking at the lights of his house through the bare trees, 200 yards and 42 years from the night he first saw something at the fence line that made no sense. The vocalization lasted about 5 seconds. It was a single tone, rising slightly at the end, the way a voice rises when asking a question or offering a greeting. Then silence. Clyde stood there for another moment. Then he walked home. He told us he did not feel afraid. He said he had not been afraid of the creature in over 30 years. He said what he felt was more complicated than fear. He said it was the feeling of being known, of standing in the dark on a mountainside in the Allegheny Highlands and being recognized by something that has watched you grow old, that has eaten the food you brought it since you were a young man, that has protected your cattle and left your family alone and kept its end of a deal that you never signed and could never explain, and that has outlasted every other commitment in your life except your marriage. He said, "I do not know what it is. I have never known what it is. All I know is that it is real, and it has been here longer than we have, and it keeps its word. And as long as I can walk up that hill, I will keep mine." The evidence is on a mountain in Highland County, Virginia, in the feeding sites maintained for 4 decades, in the tracks along the creeks, in the territorial marks on the trees, in the infrared footage on a laptop where a young man is deciding what to do with what his grandfather gave him, in cattle records that show loss rates so far below the regional average that the only explanation is one no agricultural extension agent would accept, in the quiet words of old men who have fed a predator their whole lives and never once been harmed and never once been believed by anyone who was not standing on that mountain in the dark. The mountains keep what happens on them to themselves. The ridges of the Allegheny Highlands have been doing this for longer than anyone has been writing things down. The Shawnee knew it. The settlers who came after them learned it. And the families on Jack Mountain, the ones who feed the ridge walkers and keep their silence and carry their buckets up the slope every Saturday, they know it too. The mountain holds its own. It always has. And the things that walk those ridges in the dark are as much a part of the mountain as the sandstone and the oak and the cold November wind that comes off Sounding Knob and moves through the hollow like a hand, closing over something it does not intend to release.